So tonight, we're going to talk about Solomon. Solomon's such an interesting fellow. So deeply religious, a great relationship with God, and then not always so much. And when we think about Solomon, usually we think about his wisdom. You might think about all those wives and concubines. You might think about building the temple. But when I think about Solomon, I really focus in on that idea of his wisdom. And it's fitting that his book, his writings are part of what's called wisdom literature in the Bible. And so we're going to look at the book of Proverbs tonight. The book of Proverbs is an interesting book. It's mostly little snippets. The context for a passage in Proverbs is usually one or two verses. Now, there are other longer passages, but mostly it's a bunch of short statements that make us think and have a lot of meaning. And here's just an example of the beginning of the book. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And so what that's saying is, if we want to be wise, we got to fear God. We need to seek that knowledge that he has for us. We need to find those things in his word, and we don't want to be like those fools that despise wisdom and instruction. I was not a great high school student. In fact, if I ever got an A, there was always a C to balance it out. So I had pretty much a B average. And I just despised instruction. I just didn't like it much. Somewhere along the line that changed, but I want us to think about Proverbs so that we can be wise, so that we can fear God and keep his commandments and do those things that will help us to follow his ways. And so as we think about Proverbs, and it's just, most passages are one or two verses. I mean, a lot of them just one verse, but there are some longer passages. And so when those come in, since it's very short little snippets, when we see a longer passage, that gets our attention. And we start thinking, okay, now this must be extra special. One of the best known ones is the worthy woman. At the end of the book, Proverbs 30, verse 10 through 31. And so it's got a long, more than 20 verses. And so it's important for us to think about Proverbs and to appreciate those longer passages. And there are several passages that personify wisdom. I like the idea of personification. I had an English major in college. I had double major, triple, I don't know how many I had. But anyway, I just love English. I love the English language. I love literature. That helps me with the Bible. But personification means that we're going to take an abstract concept, something that is not a person, and we're going to give that attributes or characteristics of a person. And Proverbs does that several times in the book, and so that we, it's always those long passages that we find. This is one example. We're not going to study this very long, but this is one example. Proverbs 1 and verse 20 says, "Wisdom shouts in the streets. She lifts her voice in the square." Okay, so wisdom doesn't really do that. Because wisdom is a thought. Wisdom is an abstract. But sometimes when God, in his wisdom, is trying to teach us something, especially about, the way wisdom works in the world, then he personifies wisdom as if here is somebody just shouting in the streets. I remember, I don't know if you remember this, in Oklahoma City, used to have guys that would stand on the street corner and preach. And you couldn't hear a thing that they were saying. You're never there. I mean, it's like at a stoplight. So you got about 15 seconds of mumbling. I don't think that was really good. That wasn't this. Wisdom is shown as someone who is just shouting out to us, calling to us, trying to get our attention. And so, Proverbs chapter 8. Did I go too many times? Okay. Proverbs chapter 8 is one of those long sections that personifies wisdom. And it tells us how wisdom is an eternal quality of God. I hear pages turning. That's really great. If you'd like to turn over to Proverbs chapter 8, we're going to be centered there most of the time. And so Proverbs 8 tells us that wisdom is an eternal quality of God. It's something that is just part of God. Can you imagine God without wisdom? Somebody shake their head one way or the other. No. God without wisdom is not God. It might be a pagan god, it might be a Greek god, but God is so connected to wisdom, we can't think of him without wisdom. And so in this passage, it says wisdom was there with him from the beginning. And then the next part of it says that wisdom cries out to all. I like the bullhorn concept. It's just, she's crying in the street. She's saying, listen, you got to pay attention. Focus. When I was a youth minister, I used to have to say, you got to focus. Okay, everybody do that. Everybody do it. There we go. You got to focus. I mean, you got to get rid of this stuff on the side and really focus in. That's what wisdom is doing for us. And then at the end of the section, wisdom warns of the consequences if we don't pay attention. If we don't listen, it's not like, well, you can take it or leave it. It doesn't make any difference. If we're not paying attention to God's wisdom, there are terrible things that come from that. So let's start with this first idea. Proverbs 8 tells us how that wisdom is an eternal quality of God. It was there with him in the beginning. And so Proverbs chapter 8, verse 22 and 23, this is wisdom speaking. Say, we got wisdom personified. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way. Before his works of old, from everlasting, I was established from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth. That's a poetic way of saying God's wisdom is eternal. And I like the idea of poetry. We would look at the book of Proverbs and not guess that it's poetry, because it doesn't look like poetry. You know, when I think of poetry, got short little lines and it rhymes at the end and all that kind of stuff. That's not how Hebrew poetry is. And we think about how wise God was. If you look at other writings, other religious writings in the world, sometimes they have poetry. And it has rhyme, and it has meter, and has those things that identify it as poetry. Guess what happens to that when you translate it? It's just gone. You can't take Hebrew words and make them rhyme in English or have that kind of meter like poetry has. And so God in his wisdom said, we're going to do poetry. We're not going to rhyme words. We're going to have parallel thoughts. We're going to, in a sense, rhyme thoughts. And guess what happens with that when you translate? It's perfect. You know, one of the marks of inspiration is that the Bible is so brilliant. I mean, the things that we find there are just, that just boggle your mind. It's just beyond what we would imagine to do. And so God's wisdom is eternal. And one of the reasons that's so important is that's the opposite of worldly wisdom. How often does worldly wisdom change? All the time, just all the time. I'll give an example. Some of you can't imagine that I was in high school in the 60s. We met in the 80s. We'll go back a few years. In the 1960s, there was a great concern over global cooling. Anybody remember that? It was like panic mode. It was like all these terrible things are going to happen. And so the scientists said, we follow the science. It just kills me when people say, well, we follow the science. I believe in science. I don't believe in God. I believe in science. Really? I mean, this week or last week? The scientists said we are headed for an ice age. And they said, there's going to be so much ice is going to accumulate at the poles that it's going to drop down the levels of the ocean. And these places that are, seaports, they're going to be on dry land. New York will be, far from the water. And they had all these things, and they were really upset about that. So where are those voices today? What happened to global cooling? What happened to the ice caps growing so big that, it passed. I mean, basically with the 70s, we forgot about that. And so now we hear just about the opposite. And 20 years ago, I believe it was Vice President Al Gore, said the polar caps will be gone by 2015. So as a prophet, how would we rate him? He does not get high marks, okay? Polar caps are there. 2015 came and went. Nothing really big happened. But you see, what happens is people get caught up in an idea, and they say, well, the people who are really smart believe this. The people who are really smart say that we got global cooling, or we got global warming, or we've got all these different things, and they just get completely changed over that. And here's why it's kind of pitiful. 1 Corinthians 3:19. For the wisdom of the world is foolishness before God. I mean, just let that sink in for a minute. The wisdom, the wisest things that we can come up, the best that we can get from our scientists, our philosophers, all our, great thinkers, it's just foolishness before God. For it is written, He is the one who catches the wise in their craftiness. And so God sort of looks down on us and our ideas and our wisdom and all the great things that we think that we've discovered and we're doing. And He said, come on, guys, just pay attention to what's there in the Scriptures. Another example, there are lots and lots of examples of this, but I like the Mayan calendar. Remember the Mayan calendar? It ends in 2012. Now, what happened in 2012? Well, leading up to that, people were saying, well, the Mayans, they knew so much about astronomy. It's going to be the end of the world. In fact, I like the history. Anybody like the History Channel? I don't see any. It's just really goofy, and they're always talking about aliens or Bigfoot or something. There's not a lot of history to it, but they run the reruns. And so you see the old programs that are saying, oh, the world is going to come to end, and Nostradamus said this, and the Mayan calendar said this, and all these other things. And then, and they say, it's going to end in 2012. And here we are, way past 2012. And so human wisdom does not have an enduring quality. God's wisdom endures. It's going to be good. People say, well, the Bible's not relevant. Yeah, it is. It's eternally relevant. It is an eternal quality of God. Proverbs 8 and verse 27, wisdom speaking, when He established the heavens, I was there. When He inscribed a circle on the face of the deep. Wisdom was there with God all the way through. And so this just something that is part of God. And wisdom is God's joy. God rejoices with the wisdom that He has. Proverbs 8 and verse 30, wisdom says, then I was beside Him as a master workman, and I was His daily delight, rejoicing always before Him. Now, again, this is personification. Doesn't mean that there was somebody standing next to God as He's creating, but wisdom was there as an essential part of who God is, and said, God was happy about that. God made the world. He saw that it was good. He was happy about that. And that's a great thing. And so wisdom is an essential part of who God is. I put it in my notes again. If you remove eternal wisdom from God, you've got Greek gods, you've got pagan gods asking for human sacrifice, you've got something other than the God of the Scriptures. And what's really cool about it, it's not just God, okay, this is my wisdom and y'all can do whatever you want, but I'm really wise. He makes it possible for us to share in His wisdom. That's what this is all about. Here's God's wisdom. We can read it, we can know it, we can understand it, at least to a point, and so we can share in God's wisdom. Proverbs 8, verse 32. Now, therefore, wisdom says, O sons, listen to me, for blessed are those who keep my ways. Now, when you look at these, you can say, well, that sounds just like God. Well, wisdom and God are so intimately connected, you can't really separate them. But this is wisdom saying, listen to me, and those who keep my way are going to be blessed. And so here's the first point. Wisdom is an eternal quality of God. It's one which we can share. It's one that was there from the beginning, always a part of God. Then I want us to think, in order to share, we have to pay attention. Have you noticed that you can't teach somebody something if you don't really know it? I had a good friend when I was going to school at Northeastern, and she needed help with math. Well, I'm not a great math teacher. I knew more than she did. And so, I'd sit down, try and help her with her math homework. But I'll tell you, I was out of my league really quick. We get to those X's and Y's, and I'd say, well, I don't know, you're going to have to talk to your teacher. If we don't know something, if we haven't paid attention to something, then we can't teach it. And so if we're not sharing in God's wisdom, we really can't share. If we're not into God's wisdom, we really can't share it with others. And since God proclaims wisdom, that should be enough for us. I have not seen this bumper sticker for a while, but used to see it every once in a while. It says, "The Bible said it. I believe it. That settles it." Maybe it said God said it. And I used to think, well, that doesn't really help everybody, but that's a pretty great statement. If I find it in the Bible, and this is what God says, and it's His wisdom, then that just settles it for me. And so we can rely on that wisdom. We might rely on it just because it's in the Bible, but we might also rely on it because we look into life. And people that are following God's wisdom seem to have a different quality of life than people that are foolish and going against God's wisdom. There's just a difference there. And so God's wisdom has credibility, and that means it works. That means it's something that's good in the world. It's not, I was looking at a program about people who are Muslims, and they memorize. They're great at memorizing. And if you're a Muslim student, what you do is you memorize all these things, and the teacher will say, "Tell me what this thing says," and they can just spit it out. They don't have a clue what it means, but they've memorized it. We don't want to be like that. We want to trust God's wisdom because we know, first of all, He's God, and wisdom is an eternal quality with Him, but also because we see how it works. And we have these great promises, and we see where they're leading us. And so wisdom was there with God in eternity from the beginning. And am I backing up? Proverbs chapter 8, verse 22. "The Lord possessed me at the beginning of His way. Before His works of old, from everlasting I was established from the beginning, from the earliest times on earth." That's credibility. That's long lasting. If you have a friend that endures with you as a friend when there's troubled times, that's a good, hold on to that friend. They have credibility. That's what God does for us. And human wisdom is more like fads which come and go. Anybody have a fidget spinner before? Used to be, everybody had a fidget spinner. And, it was troublesome in class because those students would be, doing that and they're not really paying attention. But how many people play with their fidget spinner anymore? I've got one sitting on my desk, and I think, okay, it was just a fad. And so God's wisdom is like a beacon in the darkness. It's calling out to us. Out of the darkness of the world, it's giving us a way to go and a way to follow. Proverbs 8, verse 2 and 3. "On top of heights beside the way, where the paths meet, she takes her stand. Beside the gates, at the opening of the city, at the entrance of the doors, she cries out." So we've got wisdom again. And she's just standing, anywhere where she can get a platform and saying, "You got to listen. You got to listen to me." And you've probably noticed here that wisdom is often personified in feminine form. And so ask the question, why is that? And I want to say from the beginning that a lot of times when we say, why does God do what He does? Most of the time the answer is, I don't really know. I can see some sense in it, but I'm not sure. But there are a couple things here. Wisdom in Hebrew is a feminine noun. Okay? Sort of like, we talked about El Reno. It's not La Reno, that would be feminine. It's El Reno, it's masculine. And so there are a lot of languages that have masculine and feminine. Hebrew has wisdom in the feminine form. Also, it's just kind of as I think about wisdom, she's crying out, reminds me of my mom. I mean, really, Rusty, don't do that. Don't go there. Do these things. Do these other things. And so, there are several reasons maybe why wisdom is portrayed as feminine. But God's wisdom calls us to hear and obey. We want to do more than just listen. She's crying out. She's just begging us to pay attention to her. And so we need to say, well, let's follow this way. Let's see how this goes. Proverbs 8, verse 35, for he who finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. That's wisdom speaking. Doesn't that sound like God? Again, it's because they are so meshed together. You can't talk about one without the other. But if we're looking for wisdom, and she's there crying out for us, crying out from the Scriptures, just calling to us to do those things that are right, and when we find her, we find life. We find the life that God has for us, and we obtain favor from the Lord. And we search in vain for a better way. Is there a better way than Christianity? I mean, if you ask people on the street, they'll say, well, this is not too bad, and these other things, they make some sense. There's no better way. God has given us the best, and apart from God, all is vanity. In Bible class back at Stillwell, we're studying Ecclesiastes. It's a discouraging book because you go, everything is emptiness and vain and striving after wind, and it's not going to lead you anywhere. And then they'll have this little nugget and say, okay, but here's what you can do. Fear God and keep His commandments. But if we try and live our lives apart from God's wisdom, it's not going to take us where we need to go. It's not going to take us where we want to go. Ecclesiastes 1:14 said, I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after wind. Solomon's saying, you know what? I've experienced this stuff. You don't have to learn on your own. You can look at my life and understand these things. And we get all these emptiness and vanity things until we get to the very end. And at the end, what's the meaning of life? Fear God, keep His commandments. That's it. And so we need to put God's wisdom in there. And again, worldly wisdom is fleeting and immaterial. Isn't it fun to blow dandelions? Your neighbor will hate you because dandelions come up all over his yard. But worldly wisdom is just passing. It doesn't really call us to anything better. That Jesus offers Himself as the only way to the Father. John 14, verse 6. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And so wisdom, that's wisdom calling out through Jesus. You want to go to the Father, we want to have a heavenly home, want to have those blessings and salvation and forgiveness and eternal life. Well, we better find it in Jesus. We better be looking for it in Jesus. Worldly wisdom disagrees. Isn't that interesting? Jesus says, I'm the way. Worldly wisdom says, nah, come on. There's got to be lots of different ways. There's got to be some other way that we can please God. We have to, whatever we do, we can figure it out. We can do those things on our own. You can make up your own way. It'll be just as good. Or you can follow these other religions and it'll be okay. So when worldly wisdom disagrees with Jesus, that means it's wrong. I mean, it's just not right. True eternal spiritual life requires hearing God's wisdom. We just can't get around that. We can't just have, some experience or just believe some things. We need to find God's wisdom and listen to it. Proverbs 1 and verse 33, he who listens to me shall live securely and shall be at ease from the dread of evil. Okay? That's saying that God's wisdom gives us security and hope. Does that mean nothing bad will ever happen to you if you're a Christian? I had an aunt, Aunt Florence. She was a character, but she used to say, well, if you're a good Christian, nothing bad will ever happen to you. Well, bad things happen to her all the time. I don't know I don't know where she came up with that, but that's not the way it works. If you're living as a Christian, sometimes bad things will happen to you because you're living as a Christian, especially in the early church. But God's wisdom gives us the security and the hope that no matter what happens, if the mountains fall into the sea, we're going to be okay. And I want us to think about Hebrews chapter 11. I like the idea of great chapters. There are some chapters in the Bible, just great chapters. 1 Corinthians 15, great chapter on the resurrection. 1 Corinthians 13, great chapter on love. Hebrews 11 is a great chapter on faith, and it gives us all these heroes, these men and women who endured great things. They endured hardship, and they remained faithful. And we ought to ask ourselves, how did they do that? Why is it that they did those things? Well, Hebrews 11:16, as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, listen to this, therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God. God looks down on the heroes of faith. God looks down on people that say, there's a better place for us, we're going to a better place, and God says, that's one of mine. That's one that, that's a good person. And so we need to desire that better country. We can endure because we have a better place. And when we lose sight of that, then we don't endure so well. I used to run a lot. And when you get sight of the finish line, there's just something, it doesn't matter if you're running a marathon or a 5K or whatever you're running. When you see that finish line, you just get a little extra boost of something, and you can go on. And so we need that in Christianity. We need that in our faith to say, I can see this heavenly city. I'm headed toward that way. Some of us are closer than others, but I'm going that way, and I can endure because that's an important place. That's a place of value for me. And so in order to inherit that, we got to pay attention, People have given their lives to give us the Bible. Those who wrote it down often were martyrs. And after that, once the Bible was written, there are people that have troubles. In Nepal right now, Nepal is a Hindu nation. And for the most part, the Hindus just kind of let Christianity go. But there are some people out there handing out tracts and preaching on the streets in a place in Nepal. And they grabbed all their tracts and put them in a big pile and burned them up. And I don't know that they hurt anybody, but we got to pay attention. And we got to put that message out there. And then we need to think about what happens if we don't listen. I go back to my mother. If I had listened to my mother, boy, I would have been so much better off. Because she said, when you do this, it's not going to be good. And I think, well, I think I know better than that. I didn't. But when we don't listen to wisdom, wherever it comes from, then that causes us some problems. Proverbs 8:36, one of my favorite verses in the Old Testament. Again, wisdom is speaking. He who sins against me injures himself. All those who hate me love death. I know that there are some people who love death, and they have some problems. But for most of us, we love life. We don't want death. But wisdom is saying, if you go against my ways, you're going to hurt yourself. Rebellion is self-destructive, and you might not end up in a hospital bed. Probably won't. But when we reject wisdom, we got problems. And without God's wisdom, we follow the pathway of sin. It's what happened to Eve in the beginning, Genesis chapter 3. But you know what? That's what happens to us. Every time that we lose sight of the pathway of God, we get off on that side road that's leading us to sin. So Proverbs 1, verse 32, the waywardness of the naive shall kill them, and the complacency of fools shall destroy them. We go against God's wisdom, it's going to hurt us. And so temporary pleasures can pull us away from permanent blessings. And there again, we got to visualize that city that we're going to. We got to visualize that goal and keep our eyes on Jesus so that when the temporary things come along, that they don't attract us so much. Proverbs 11, verse 3, the integrity of the upright will guide them, but the falseness of the treacherous will destroy them. Which way are we going to go? We're going to go the way of guidance in God's way, or are we going to listen to the treacherous things? Think about Moses. Moses is a hero of faith because he took the eternal view. And we know he didn't do that perfectly any more than we do things perfectly. He had some big problems from time to time. But he was looking for a different place. He was looking for something beyond just what was happening in his life. Hebrews 11, verse 25, especially like the King James. Here's Moses, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. You think about what Moses could have had in the household of Pharaoh. I mean, Pharaoh was the greatest ruler of the greatest nation at that time, and Moses is right in there with him, part of the family. He could have stuck with that and really had a lot of things going for him temporarily, but he said, I don't want that. I want the permanent. I want the enduring. And so rebellion against God's wisdom does not liberate us. There are a lot of people who tell you it will. There are a lot of people who say, you don't need that Bible. You don't need that guilt trip that God is trying to lay on you, that these religious people are trying to say to you. You don't need that. Just go your own way. You're smart enough to direct your own paths. And it's not going to give us freedom. It's the way of destruction. And without God's way of wisdom, we're wretched. It's a commitment to self-destruction. It's a commitment to doing the things that please me right now, but may have really terrible things later on. So with God's way of wisdom, we're saved. One of the things that just confused the devil out of people, that's probably a bad choice of word. One thing that confused people in the early centuries is you're telling me God's son came to earth and they killed him and he allowed that? That just doesn't make any sense, to a lot of people, especially the Roman mind. Why would God would come down and he'd conquer and he's, just doing all those things. Here's God's wisdom. It's the cross. It's Jesus dying for our sins so that we don't have to suffer those things. And that's great wisdom. We need a commitment to life, not to rebellion, not to momentary pleasures. And so wisdom cries out for our commitment. Let's do something. Let's quit playing around at what we're doing. Let's be serious. Let's follow God's way. So Proverbs 8 verse 35, one more time. He who finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. Any other way is the way of foolishness. It really is. It may not seem like it. There may not be a lot of people on that way. But any other way than the way of God's wisdom, it's not going to take us where we want to go. So, the asterisk means this is the conclusion. Yay! The writings of Solomon reflect his wisdom. It came from God. Could have asked for riches, he asked for wisdom. He asked for a way to conduct this country, to lead it in a way that would be a blessing. And God's wisdom is eternal. It's not changing every day. It's not a fad. It's something that endures. It's the opposite of worldly wisdom. And we can see that. I mean, you see people that just do terrible things, and you wonder, what were they thinking? And most of the time, they weren't thinking. But they certainly weren't thinking about God, and they certainly weren't thinking about the right way to go. And so wisdom cries out to us. And it says, seek that wisdom that's going to save your soul. Look for those things that are going to direct your lives in righteous ways. And since God proclaims wisdom, it ought to be enough for us. When we trust in God, that's what faith means, trust. When we're trusting in God and trusting his promises, then when God says it, then we say, well, that ought to be enough. That's what God said. It's got to be right. And so God's wisdom calls for us to hear, calls for us to obey, calls for us to take that path that leads us all the way to heaven. And when we follow it, we can inherit an eternal home prepared for us. We don't earn it. Jesus did the work. We just get into the family so that we can inherit it. So, Proverbs 8, verse 36, one more time. He who sins against me injures himself. Don't injure yourself. I have a bad ankle. Now, I used to do a lot of running, and running is hard on your body, and I overdid it, and so now I'm reaping the consequences. I injured myself more than once. And back, especially in high school, the coaches would say, it's just in your head, so we keep on going, injure ourselves more. But we don't want to be like that with our lives. We want to protect ourselves. We want to find God's protection. And we don't want to hate wisdom, because when we do, it means we love death. And so think about Jesus on the cross, what that means for us, the wisdom that was displayed there. And so I want to say thank you for the invitation to speak. Thank you for your kind attention. I appreciate that so much. Just thank you for being here together, enjoying our fellowship, finding that reinforcement and support that'll help us tomorrow and the next day and the next day. So, thank you.
And the church did say. That's great. Thanks, Rusty. I appreciate that very much. One word you said that just stuck out in your lesson tonight, and it was almost passed over, but it wasn't passed over. It was there. Temporarily. Temporarily. You know what temporarily means? It won't last. What you're talking about, what Rusty was talking about tonight, will last. The wisdom of God. You follow it. And the other thing you said was commitment to life. You commit to wisdom, you commit to life. The wisdom of God, eternity is there. Life is there. Great lesson. Appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here tonight to worship the Lord and study His Word. May you have a great rest of the week.